The spotlight hit Ace Frehley's silver makeup like a supernova at exactly 9:47 p.m. on July 12, 1980. And in that frozen moment before everything changed, 100,000 people saw the Space Ace stumble. His custom Les Paul guitar slipped from his trembling fingers and hit the stage floor with a feedback shriek that cut through the arena like a warning siren. Then Ace Frehley, the man behind the metallic mask, the guitarist who had defined Kiss's sound for 7 years, dropped to his knees on the Rosemont Horizon stage in Chicago. The pyrotechnics were still firing behind him. The dry ice smoke was still billowing, and the opening chords of Cold Gin were still echoing when the Space Ace collapsed completely under the stage lights that had become his second home. What happened in the next 4 minutes would become one of the most closely guarded secrets in rock history. Gene Simmons, standing 15 feet away in his full demon makeup, made a split-second decision that no one in that arena expected, a choice that would later be described by Paul Stanley as either the bravest or most reckless thing he had ever witnessed on a stage. Before we continue with what happened next, if you want to hear more untold stories from rock's golden age, subscribe to our channel. We bring you the real stories behind the legends, the moments that shaped music history, but were never fully told until now. The 1980 Unmasked tour had been trouble from its inception. The Unmasked album, released just 3 months before that July night in Chicago, represented a significant departure from the hard rock thunder that had built the band's empire. But the real crisis wasn't happening in the record stores. The real crisis was happening inside Ace Frehley. Tour manager Howard Marks had been keeping detailed notes of every performance, and his journals from that period paint a picture of a band approaching a breaking point. Ace was arriving later and later to sound checks. His guitar solos, once tight and precise, were becoming erratic. The bottle of Jack Daniels that used to last him 3 shows was now empty before the first encore. Peter Criss, the Catman, had already been dealing with his own struggles, and there was an unspoken understanding between him and Ace, a bond formed by being the two members who felt increasingly marginalized by Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley's creative control. 3 days before the Chicago show, Peter had pulled Ace aside and asked him directly if he was okay to continue the tour. Ace's response was simply to laugh and take another drink. But what happened backstage 2 hours before showtime would set the stage for the disaster no one saw coming. The pre-show ritual had always been sacred for Kiss, but on July 12, 1980, Ace wasn't in his designated area. Security found him in a storage room near the loading dock, sitting on a road case with his head in his hands. The makeup wasn't applied yet. The silver Space Ace persona was still just makeup tubes and brushes waiting in his dressing room. At that moment, he was just Paul Daniel Frehley from the Bronx, and he was visibly shaking. The tour doctor was called, a physician who had been traveling with major rock acts since the early 70s. His examination of Ace lasted 12 minutes, and what he found concerned him enough that he recommended canceling the show. Ace's blood pressure was elevated, his pupils were dilated, his hands had a tremor that he couldn't control. The doctor's recommendation was clear. This man should not perform tonight. Gene Simmons received this information at 7:15 p.m., exactly 2 hours and 45 minutes before showtime. The venue was already filling with fans who had paid premium prices for tickets. The production crew had spent 3 days setting up the elaborate stage design. And most importantly, this was Kiss, a band that had built its reputation on never canceling, never disappointing, always delivering the spectacle no matter what. Gene's decision was made in less than 30 seconds. The show would go on. Ace would perform. The guitar tech was instructed to keep backup guitars ready at all times. The stage manager was told to position extra security near Ace's performance area. And Gene himself made a decision that would prove crucial. He would stay close to Ace throughout the entire show, close enough to intervene if necessary. When Kiss took the stage at 9:30 p.m., the roar from 100,000 fans shook the entire complex. The opening pyrotechnic burst sent flames 40 feet into the air, and the four figures emerging through that manufactured chaos looked exactly like the gods of rock that their fans expected. Gene Simmons, 7 feet tall in his platform boots. Paul Stanley, the star child, already moving with confident swagger. Peter Criss behind his elevated drum kit. And Ace Frehley, the space ace, his silver makeup and LED-lit guitar marking him as the extraterrestrial element in this theatrical army. The first 3 songs went exactly as planned. Detroit Rock City opened with its signature car crash sound effect, and Ace hit every note with the precision that had made him one of the most influential guitarists of his generation. Deuce followed, with Paul Stanley commanding the audience. Then Strutter, a reminder of where they had started. To everyone watching, it seemed like the pre-show concerns had been overblown, but those close enough to see the details noticed something different. Ace's usual between-song banter was completely absent. He stayed in his designated zone, moving less than usual, conserving energy. During Strutter, Gene Simmons moved closer to Ace's side of the stage than usual, a subtle protective measure. The set list called for Cold Gin 4th, one of Ace's signature songs that featured one of his most recognizable guitar solos. When Paul Stanley announced the song, the crowd's response was immediate and massive. Cold Gin was a fan favorite, and this Chicago audience had been waiting for it. And that's when everything changed. Ace started the opening riff perfectly, his Les Paul cutting through the arena with that distinctive tone that thousands of guitarists would try to replicate, but never quite capture. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley moved into their positions, choreography they had performed hundreds of times. Peter Criss locked into the drum pattern. The pyrotechnics were primed. Everything was synchronized. But Ace Frehley was not synchronized with his own body anymore. The trembling that the tour doctor had observed was getting worse. The stage lights, brighter and hotter than usual, were combining with his altered state to create a physical crisis. The guitar in his hands suddenly felt impossibly heavy. The fretboard started to blur in his vision. When Ace stumbled during the second verse, most people thought it was part of the performance. When his guitar slipped and hit the stage with that feedback, shriek, some fans assumed it was a planned effect. But when the space ace dropped to his knees and then collapsed completely onto the stage floor, there was a moment of collective confusion that spread through the entire arena like a wave. The choice Gene Simmons made in the next 10 seconds would define not just that night, but the entire future relationship between the band and their fans. Gene's bass was still strapped across his chest. The demon makeup was running slightly from heat and sweat. 100,000 people were watching, though many still didn't understand what was happening. The song was falling apart around him, and Gene Simmons had to decide whether to stop the show or do something that no one expected. He didn't stop the show. Instead, Gene stepped to his microphone and addressed the audience directly in his full demon voice. "The Space Ace has left the building for a moment," Gene announced, his voice carrying theatrical menace. "But this is Kiss, and we don't stop for anything. So here's what's going to happen. We're going to keep playing, and when our brother is ready to come back, we'll still be here." And then Gene Simmons did something that the band had never done before in their entire career. While roadies rushed onto the stage to help Ace, while the tour doctor appeared from the wings, Gene launched into an impromptu bass solo. Not a planned part of the show, but a raw, aggressive bass performance that kept the energy from collapsing. The pyrotechnics kept firing, creating bursts of flame and smoke. Paul Stanley began calling back to the audience, getting them to clap in rhythm with Gene's bass. Peter Criss added percussion elements, creating a stripped-down rhythm. What was happening was not in any playbook, but it was working. But backstage, a different drama was unfolding that would have long-term implications for everyone involved. Ace regained consciousness less than 2 minutes after collapsing. The tour doctor's immediate assessment was concerning. Ace's blood pressure had spiked dangerously high. His pulse was irregular. The doctor's recommendation was immediate and unambiguous. Ace needed to be transported to a hospital. He should not return to the stage. But as Ace's consciousness returned and he understood what had happened, his first words were asking whether the show was still going on. When told that his bandmates were still on stage, something changed in his expression. The Space Ace persona seemed to take over. "I'm going back out there," Ace stated, and despite all protests, there was a determination in his voice that made it clear this wasn't a discussion. The makeup was quickly touched up. A fresh bottle of water was pressed into his hands. His Les Paul was retrieved and checked. And less than 4 minutes after collapsing, Ace Frehley was walking back toward the stage entrance. The moment Ace stepped back into the stage lights, the roar from 100,000 fans was unlike anything any of the band members had heard before. This wasn't just appreciation for a performance. This was something deeper, a collective release of tension, a celebration of resilience. Gene's improvised solo came to a natural end. Paul Stanley's voice cracked with genuine emotion as he welcomed the Space Ace back. And Ace Frehley plugged in his guitar and launched into the solo from Cold Gin exactly where he had left off. The performance that followed would become one of the most talked-about moments in Kiss history. Ace's guitar playing for the remainder of the show was different from anything he had done before. There was a rawness to it, an emotional intensity that went beyond technical proficiency. Every note seemed to carry the weight of what had just happened. The guitar solo in Cold Gin stretched longer than usual. When the song ended, the ovation lasted nearly 3 minutes. The setlist was modified on the fly, with Paul and Gene quietly eliminating some of the more demanding numbers. Beth, Peter Criss's signature ballad, was moved up to provide a slower moment. Black Diamond was performed at a slightly reduced tempo that most wouldn't notice but made a crucial difference. When Kiss finally left the stage after their encores, the 4 band members walked off in silence. The usual post-show energy was replaced with something more somber. Gene Simmons, still in his full demon makeup, approached Ace without a word and embraced him, a gesture that shocked everyone present. Ace Frehley was taken to a Chicago hospital after the show for evaluation, though this fact was kept from the press. The official statement simply mentioned that the show had been one of the most energetic performances of the tour, with no reference to the collapse. The tour doctor's report documented the serious health risks Ace had been facing and recommended immediate intervention, recommendations that would largely go unheeded as the tour pushed forward. For Gene Simmons, the night represented a turning point in his understanding of what Kiss had become. His decision to keep the show going when Ace collapsed would be debated for decades. Was it the right call? Was it cruel? Was it simply the only option? Paul Stanley's perspective, shared years later, focused on the collective decision-making that had defined Kiss throughout their career. The moment Ace collapsed wasn't just about one person's health crisis. It was about the unspoken agreements that had allowed four very different personalities to function as a unit. And for Ace Frehley himself, that night in Chicago became a line of demarcation, a before and after moment that would shape the remaining years of his time with Kiss. The Space Ace character began to feel more like a prison, a persona that demanded performances even when the human being underneath was struggling to survive. The truth about what happened on July 12, 1980, wouldn't emerge fully until decades later, when band members and crew began sharing their memories. The bootleg recordings from that night captured Gene's announcement and the improvised performance, but they couldn't capture the backstage panic or the decision-making process. What those recordings did capture was the sound of 100,000 fans responding to something they had never expected. Vulnerability from a band that had always projected invincibility. When Ace returned to the stage and completed the performance, it wasn't just a guitarist finishing a concert. It was a moment of human resilience that transcended the makeup and costumes. Ace Frehley continued performing with Kiss for another 2 years, but the trajectory was already set. The 1982 departure and the decades that followed all had their roots in moments like that July night. The Space Ace character that had given him fame had also demanded a price that became increasingly difficult to pay. And the 100,000 fans who watched Ace collapse and then return received something they hadn't paid for, a glimpse behind the curtain, a moment of reality in a spectacle designed to be larger than reality. The story exists in fragments and memories, in bootleg recordings and whispered conversations, but the core truth remains. On July 12, 1980, Ace Frehley fell and then got back up, and in that simple act, he embodied something essential about rock and roll. He showed that beneath the silver makeup and LED guitars, there was still a human being from the Bronx who refused to quit, even when quitting might have been the wiser choice. And that, more than any platinum record or sold-out arena, is what makes legends.